We have several descendants of Asil and Maydell Palmer with us today, and we'd like you to stand up so we can thank you. Thank you very much. They have established an endowment fund that allows us to have speakers who come from Canada, and we're so appreciative that we can do this on an annual basis. Our speaker today has served his country with great distinction in Africa, Latin America, and North America. Prior to taking up his current assignment in Washington, D.C., he served as a national security advisor to Canada's Prime Minister, basically doing what Condoleezza Rice does today in the White House. He is married to Margarita Fuentes Kergin, who is with us today. Mrs. Kergin, would you please stand so we can recognize you as well? And we also have with us Sue Garbowitz from the Canadian Consulate General's Office in Los Angeles, and Doug Patterson from the new Canadian Consulate, which is just being opened in Denver, and we welcome you as well. The Kergins are proud parents of 3 sons, and college age or just finished college, and that's fantastic. It is a great honor to introduce the ambassador to you. They've had the opportunity this morning to meet with President Hinckley and President Monson and President Faust, a really quite special occasion. And again, it's a great honor for Brigham Young University to greet the Ambassador of Canada to the United States of America, His Excellency Michael F. Kergin.
Thank you, and thank you for the very good crowd that's coming to hear me speak over the next 20-25 minutes. My great interest in this is, of course, to interact and to have some questions and answers back and forth, so that'll be the interesting part. I have to say that it is a singular honor for me to be introduced by Professor Earl Fry. I had, on the plane ride from Minneapolis here to Salt Lake City, looked at his very extensive bibliography. As a matter of fact, almost took me the whole flight to be able to go through all the publications that he actually has written. And I sort of said, well, maybe at least, if he's published so much, he'd probably be an older man than me. I won't feel so bad by comparison. But no, I arrived at the airport, and here's somebody who's actually ended up graduating from university later than I did. So I sort of pale in comparison in terms of production. But thank you very much for those lovely words. I'm also particularly proud to be delivering the Asil and Maydell Palmer Lecture. Asil Palmer was a great Canadian scientist and agriculturalist, and his contributions were especially important to the rural community where he lived and where he served. And I think Western Canada today is a real beneficiary of his life and work. It's a marvelous pleasure for me to be here in Provo, a spectacular part of the country, and one that I had hoped to visit for some time. Utah holds great attraction to all Canadians. Well over 100,000 of us visit these parts every year. The majestic surroundings aside, many Canadians are also pulled by the strong ties with Utah, that Utah has with Canada, in particular with Western Canada, where I originated from. These connections range from familial. The town of Leavitt, Alberta, is named after the governor's ancestors, to cultural. The Sundance Film Festival is a key showcase for Canadian filmmakers, to the thriving trade between Utah and Canada, which totaled over $2 billion last year. And here at Brigham Young University, the Canadian Studies program, established by Dr. Fry in 1980, grew from the collaborative efforts of BYU's Delbert Palmer and the University of Alberta's Brigham Card. BYU houses one of the greatest collections of Canadian literature in the United States, and more Canadian students choose to pursue higher education at BYU than anywhere else in the United States. These academic, as well as cultural, military, and commercial exchanges contribute to the strength of both our countries. They are the bedrock of the Canada-U.S. relationship. And when Einstein wrote that, quote, "Friendship is partnership," end of quote, he could well have been describing the Canada-U.S. relationship. Because in so doing, he neatly captured the idea that the foundation of the relationship lies in friendship, but that friendship also carries an obligation or a commitment which is at the root of any viable partnership. And this commitment must be to the citizens of both our countries, a commitment to provide them with greater security, prosperity, and improved quality of life. These goals are readily attainable when our respective leaders cooperate together and our citizens maintain close ties. And I'm happy to report that with regard to Canada and the United States, such is the case. 2 years ago, when we woke to the scourge of terrorism on North American soil, the same terrorism that has wreaked devastation across the globe, security became the greatest preoccupation for both governments. In this difficult war being fought on so many levels, the United States has no greater ally than Canada. Both abroad and at home, our commitment is clear. Canada was among the first to join the U.S.-led coalition in Afghanistan, operating seamlessly with U.S. troops in crucial stages of the war. We participated in special operations where highly sophisticated Canadian expertise made important contributions to the war against the Taliban under the command of the 101st Airborne, the only country to work directly under U.S. command. Canada returned to Afghanistan just last August, joining NATO's International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, with our single largest military contribution since the Korean War. Canada is rotating about 4,000 troops through ISAF over the year, constituting the largest non-U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. And we will take command of ISAF next January. Canadian troops have taken on a dangerous yet crucial role, giving stability and democracy a fighting chance in that unhappy country. The recent loss of Canadian lives in no way diminishes our commitment. In Iraq, our representatives in Baghdad are exploring how best to synchronize our assistance with that of the United States and other coalition members. We were among the first countries to announce reconstruction assistance to post-conflict Iraq. By June, Canada announced $225 million financial contribution for humanitarian and reconstruction assistance. 10 days ago, Canada announced it will give an additional $35 million to international non-governmental organizations to help improve access to basic social and economic services in an effort to create greater social stability in Iraq. Aware of the capacity for terrorist elements to proliferate in regions bereft of peace, order, and good government, we are determined both to help alleviate human suffering and to improve the security environment. Many decades ago, during the Cold War, Canada and the United States jointly developed the North American Aerospace Defense Agreement, or NORAD, to enhance continental security against the threat of Soviet bombers. And NORAD is just as relevant today. Because rogue states are developing missile capabilities, Canadians and Americans work side by side at NORAD's joint headquarters in Colorado Springs, providing air defense and warning of potential missile threats to North America originating anywhere in the world. In fact, in the morning of 9/11, it was a Canadian Watch Office under Canadian command which directed NORAD's initial response to the terrorist attacks on the United States by clearing airspace and scrambling fighters from both countries. Domestically, Canada is also hard at work to improve North American security. We have frozen terrorist assets and introduced legislation to obstruct their fundraising. We have tightened refugee regulations to ensure improved compliance and surveillance. And landmark legislation has given Canada's law enforcement agencies additional tools with which to shut down terrorist organizations. However, I would say that the area in which we have made the greatest progress since 9/11 has been at our shared border. And this border has long been the envy of the international community. Over 80 years ago, Sir Winston Churchill remarked that, quote, that long frontier from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans guarded only by neighborly respect and honorable obligations, is an example to every country and a pattern for the future of the world." End of quote. Despite the new security measures required in the wake of the tragic events of September the 11th, our border continues to be less a dividing line between two countries than a testament to the enterprising spirit of two successful partners. And I submit that it continues to serve as a blueprint for good neighbors everywhere. The Smart Border Agreement, signed by Governor Ridge and Deputy Prime Minister Manley in December 2001, is a partnership which extends beyond our two federal governments to include the private sector and an array of local, regional, and federal agencies on both sides of the border. The Smart Border Agreement encompasses over 30 innovative measures for improving security and efficiency and covers everything from customs officials operating in each other's seaports, agreements on refugee and visa issues, improved infrastructure, and increased information sharing among law enforcement and intelligence officials. Excellent progress has also been made by adopting a risk management approach at the border and coupling it with advanced technologies. Risk management means that you use intelligence and shared information to reach a common understanding of who poses a risk at your border. Advanced technologies allow you to monitor electronically the low-risk users of the border so as to concentrate intensive human resources on the higher-risk candidates, in fact, making the border more user-friendly, but for friendly users. This unique approach to a 5,500-mile common border was developed by hard work, pragmatism, and above all, a sense that cooperation trumps confrontation. And that's what I call partnership. A more secure and efficient border also allows us to keep up with the enormous surge in commercial traffic between Canada and the United States, the result of our free trade agreement and later NAFTA. Some 80% of the $430 billion annual commerce comes by surface transport. Since NAFTA came into effect in 1989, trade between Canada and the United States has more than doubled. And that's what I call progress. This trend is also reflected in Utah's trade with Canada. Last year, because of a large sale of Bombardier regional jets to SkyWest Airlines, Canada exported about as much to Utah as to the country of Mexico. Salt Lake City-based iOmega has several of Canada's largest companies as clients, including the Royal Bank of Canada, the Bank of Montreal. And Canadian investors have shown tremendous interest in property and resource development in Utah. With an economy less than 1/10 the size of the U.S. economy, Canada imports almost 1/5 of all U.S. exported goods, more than Japan, Germany, Britain, Italy, China, and Hong Kong combined. Yet our innovative free trade agreements have done more than permit rapid trade growth. They've accelerated the pace of economic integration. Canadian and U.S. companies increasingly view NAFTA as a collectivity. They make investment and production decisions taking advantage of the respective strengths of each one of the NAFTA partners. In the steel industry, for instance, Canada and the United States are each other's best, most secure, and reliable customers, with two-way trade amounting to about $7 billion annually in steel. Producers on both sides of the border buy their raw materials from the same suppliers and often share ownership of the same sources of supply. At the last NAFTA Trade Ministers meeting in Montreal, Mexico agreed to join its two partners in looking at the prospects of an integrated North American steel market. The Canada-U.S. energy market is another example of a win-win situation. Canada is far and away the largest foreign energy supplier to the United States. With instability in the Middle East, it should give some peace of mind to know that 94% of your natural gas imports, close to 100% of the United States electricity imports, and more crude and refined oil products than any other foreign supplier, including Saudi Arabia, come from the United States friendly neighbor next door. Here in the West, you are probably aware of the enormous energy imports that come from north of the 49th parallel, from British Columbia and Alberta, as well as the territories and Alaska. The pending energy legislation in Congress will further our mutually profitable energy relationship. But this energy partnership depends on unfettered trade, free from price-distorting subsidies, which we hope will be removed from the current version of the Senate bill. A new and important source of Western energy will come from private sector plans to build natural gas pipelines from Alaska and the Mackenzie Valley. Canada believes that the market badly needs this energy and will provide the large amounts of capital required to develop these exciting energy sources. The Mackenzie Delta gas pipeline, which could come on stream as early as 2008, will be built without subsidies. There is no doubt that economic integration has lowered production costs through the laws of comparative advantage, making both the United States and Canada more competitive internationally. The corollary is that when challenges do occur, we must address them cooperatively and together. Never has this been more true than last summer, following the discovery of a single case of BSE in a Canadian cow. For over 20 years, Canada's and United States beef industry, with its similar regulatory standards and high quality, has been one of the greatest beneficiaries of economic integration. So this incident has had an important impact on both sides of the border. While the United States has recognized the safety of Canadian beef and has resumed imports of Canadian beef and game, trade in live cattle has yet to begin, largely due to pressures from third markets in Asia. The absence of cattle imports from Canada is exacerbating the already tight supply of U.S. beef, putting some additional pressure on prices. In the United States, meatpacking plants are currently hardest hit by this. And just this morning I was watching a CNN program and where they were talking about the price of beef over the last year having increased by 80%. And people now starting to move to chicken and so on. Of course, this has an incredible impact on the restaurateurs who are, of course, in the beef retail business. Now, I understand that Utah is among the 3 states with the greatest purchase of Canadian cattle. I'm pleased, though, to report that we are working actively with our U.S. friends for more realistic standards to govern international trade in beef affected by a highly restricted incidence of BSE, such as in the case of Canada, or as might occur here in the United States. At almost $440 billion in trade each year, or $1.1 billion every single day, Canadian-U.S. trade is the largest partnership in the world. For such an extensive trading relationship, ours is relatively friction-free. The disputes which tend to garner so much attention, like softwood lumber or wheat, while important, comprise less than 2% of the commercial activity between our two countries. And even then, when we are at loggerheads, no pun intended, we can turn to the dispute settlement mechanisms that we have built in to NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. That said, however, a bilaterally negotiated settlement of such disputes as softwood lumber or wheat are far preferable to the frustratingly lengthy, costly, and onerous battles waged through international litigation. And I can honestly say, as a living example, that with all due respect to international trade lawyers, government officials come far cheaper. Canada-U.S. groundbreaking environmental agreements are yet another example of the progressive thinking which marks our partnership. The visionary Boundary Waters Treaty and the accompanying International Joint Commission are as important today as they were at their inception in 1909. And I know that in Utah, you are concerned about air pollution moving in from outside the state. Canada's had similar concerns. With the 1991 Air Quality Agreement, Canada and the United States are successfully reducing emissions of major pollutants that caused acid rain, a veritable scourge for delicate aquatic life, plant life, and the associated food chain in the Maritimes and the northeastern United States. A direct derivative of that agreement, the Border Air Quality Strategy, announced in June, will greatly improve our understanding of pollutants and air movement. This is a marvelous example of the North American partnership, which involves federal, state, and provincial governments, First Nations, and local communities. You might also be aware or familiar with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which in the United States falls under the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. The plan brings together the private sector with governments, both at the national and subnational levels, to conserve essential habitat for the migratory birds which carry no passports and for which our national boundaries have no meaning. Underpinning these many partnerships in security, in trade, in energy, and in environment is a network of consulates throughout the United States. They form the relay points for business, cultural, and political connections linking our two countries. Last month, the Canadian government announced the phased opening of 7 new consulates and the appointment of some 20 honorary consuls in the United States. There is no better evidence, in my opinion, of the growing importance of the U.S. relationship to Canada. The success of this partnership is rooted in hard work, and it has been marked by a commitment by both sides to improve the well-being of our North American citizens. To improve security, we have fought terrorism abroad and at home, and are looking at new ways of deepening cooperation through NORAD. We have developed innovative procedures to make our border at once more safe and more efficient. To enhance our economies, we have developed the Free Trade Agreement, which has surpassed our expectations in every respect. And in order to better our quality of life, we have jointly safeguarded our shared environment for almost a century. And this, perhaps, is the most important and enduring of legacies, provided we stay the course of partnership. Harry Truman once said that, quote, "Progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better," end of quote. Our many achievements would not have been possible without the thoughtful and brave political leadership President Truman wrote about. In the coming months, after Prime Minister Chrétien retires, Canadians will be asked to choose a new Prime Minister. A change in leadership will doubtlessly bring with it a fresh mandate and a desire to explore new avenues for progress in Canada-U.S. cooperation. At the same time, the granite foundation of our relationship has never cracked or weakened. Indeed, the myriad cross-border connections created by our citizens over the decades have given this partnership strength and prosperity. Together, they have confronted challenges, created opportunities, and promoted progress. And I have every confidence, therefore, Canadians and Americans will forever succeed as partners in progress. Thank you. So now the real fun begins. So, do you want to monitor or do you just interact? I'm quite happy to interact.
If there are any questions, we have some time.
Okay, I know in the last couple of years there's been a lot of things that have affected relationships between Canada and the United States, namely Afghanistan, SARS, those types of things. What have the effects of overall? What have the effects of that been on relations politically and economically? Have you seen that it's improved despite those things, or has it taken a hit because of those things?
Good question. There's multi-part to that. On Afghanistan, Canada has been, I think, very, very supportive. And the fact that we did lose some people in Afghanistan, I don't think, in any way was directed or in any way damaged that relationship. On the contrary, I think probably there, Canada and the United States are really shoulder to shoulder, have a very, very similar objective. The United States has lost people in Afghanistan as well. So there, that's really not been a negative. It's been more of a positive, because there it's the war against terrorism. Iraq's a little bit different. There we had a difference of view in terms of the role of the United Nations providing a mandate for or an authorization to go into Iraq in a military way. That didn't mean that Canada opposed the United States or obstructed the United States anyway. It just felt that this was not a coalition, this was not a war that Canada would enter in a military sense unless there were Security Council sanction for that. We weren't alone in that decision. We were perhaps a little different from some other countries in the sense that we didn't try to use UN machinery to try and block U.S. involvement. On the contrary, we were actually trying to bridge some helpful language on the Security Council at the time. And as soon as the military part of the war was over, in terms of the initial invasion, we moved very quickly to indicate, as I said in my remarks, to try and find ways we could support the Coalition Provisional Authority, in fact, put people into the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad. The BSC and the SARS is more of one of those sort of accidents that happen. Thank goodness, in a way, SARS didn't take off in the United States. Thank goodness there wasn't a case of BSC, mad cow, found in the United States. It could have happened. It's one of those situations, because I think both our countries are equally strict in terms of regulatory control and to ensure the health of our citizens. By the luck of fate, it happened to be in Canada. We understand to a great extent the concerns that Americans had, particularly coming to Toronto when we did have SARS, and a number of people in the health care context affected by SARS. And, of course, we had a number of deaths in SARS. And it's understandable that people would want to stay away. It did have a devastating impact on Toronto's economy. There's no question about it. But we were also supported by the United States because, interestingly enough, the World Health Organization had given us a bit of a negative reading on how the reaction was, which we felt was a bit unfair. But the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta had come up and done their examination, investigation of how we had tried to contain SARS and what we'd done in terms of protecting the population, and they were extremely positive in their assessment of the Canadian reaction, which for us was very, very important to have that support. And it was based on science. They weren't doing it just to be nice to us, but that was very, very helpful in that respect. The BSE is an issue that's a bit more complicated. It has such toxic reputation when you think of mad cow disease, which is the way it's sort of noted in the newspapers, and think of what the United Kingdom had in terms of discovering their disease. They were discovering 3,000 and 4,000 cases a week for an extended period of time, and ended up slaughtering several million herds of cattle. But it was widespread. In Canada, it was just the one case, isolated, and they still haven't quite figured out how that cow got it. It was an older cow, and one assumes it may have had sort of exposure to feed 5 or 6 years ago, before we had, as the United States, changed our regulations with respect to certain types of feed that could be given to cows that might actually contaminate them. That's the speculation that we have. The United States understandably shut the border down. We would have done the same thing if there'd been a case in the United States. What we're doing now is working through very, very complex and I think very cooperatively our new rulemaking that essentially says if you find one case of mad cow and you've done all the forensics and destroyed all the cattle that cow could ever have come in contact in, and there is no other incidents, then this then would suggest that there is no cause for concern for human consumption, given the fact that even if you were to eat a cow or a cow that had mad cow or BSE, the chances of contamination from the animal to the human is a very, very small one. But you would have to eat an awful lot of diseased cattle in order to be susceptible to that. And here's, I say, we have one incidence. So that recognition, I think, and working together, because our industries are so integrated, I think has made some progress in terms of our own internal relationship in North America and with Mexico too, which is part of this. Our real problem is the Asian markets, and Japan has had mad cow, didn't handle it very well about 7 or 8 years ago. That inevitably, quite correctly, spooked the Japanese population. The consumption of beef went down by about 40 to 50%. Because they didn't handle it well, it became a political problem in Japan, and so they are much more, should I say, politically careful or overly cautious in terms of the importation of beef that might have been intermingled. So what they have said to the United States, if there is any mingling of Canadian beef with the U.S. product, we're going to close the border to the U.S. exports. The problem is our beef industry is so integrated, it's very hard to be able to sort of disaggregate and say there isn't any connection. So it's something which both countries are working through with the Asians. So long answer to a very good question. I think generally speaking, we've had our ups and downs. That is what happens in the U.S.-Canada relationship. Over time, however, it's very solid. It's very based on same values and we share the same part of the North American real estate. And I think the respect and support is there, and we try and solve our problems pretty rapidly, which we've done with the border.
My name is Sergio Martinez. I'm from Mexico, Acapulco, and thank you for answering our questions and for being here visiting BYU. The question is how Canada has benefited from the extension of NAFTA towards Mexico, and how Mexico can help achieve the goals of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, it's very interesting when the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States was expanded and Mexico entered into its own negotiations under President Salinas and George Bush Sr. To do a parallel free trade agreement. We immediately said, no, we don't want to have the United States as hub and spoke, where they can do a deal over here and deal. We want to be sort of all in this together. And Mexico, I think, very quickly picked up that it's better to be around the table, 3 around the table, than have shuttle diplomacy where you've got 2 and then somebody else comes in the room and you do another deal and back and forth. So both Mexico and Canada collaborated very quickly when the United States was interested in doing a parallel free trade agreement with Mexico to make it a trilateral arrangement. And I think we've all benefited from that. Canada's benefited in particular because while we had a lot of relationships with Mexico culturally, tourism, and to some extent on energy, we were reporting on our East Coast a fair amount of Mexican energy. We really didn't have much real trading relationship. And the fact that we were negotiating the same rules of the game in terms of government procurement issues, in terms of dispute settlement mechanisms, allowed Canadian trade to increase, and the contacts between Canadian and Mexican businessmen, which hadn't been that extensive before, to expand tremendously. So I think our trade with Mexico has almost doubled since the conclusion of NAFTA back in 1993. And with the trade, of course, comes better contacts of individuals and better knowledge of each other's societies. And before, we'd have kind of been sort of, I guess, stymied or mesmerized by the United States in the middle. It's a very large hyper economy that's between the two, and we're dealing directly with that. Now we're starting to deal over the top of that. We're starting to deal directly, Mexico and Canada, in ways which we didn't do before the free trade agreement. So I think it's been very healthy for both trade, people-to-people relationships, cultural exchanges, and so on. I think we're starting to know Mexico much better, not just as a tourist destination, but as a people, a culture, and an economic entity. So it's been very positive from our perspective. Don't know about Mexico. We'll have to talk to the Mexican ambassador about that.
With the microphone.
Hello, sir. My name is Kergin from Winnipeg, Manitoba. And Canada has a reputation of being easier to enter as opposed to the United States. Is this true? And if so, how will Canada be affected by the new regulations that the United States is putting out for visas from foreign countries?
I'm glad you asked me that question, as they say. In fact, this is one of the issues that I get that question a lot, that there's an assumption that Canada is easier to enter as an immigrant or as a visitor or as a as a refugee than the United States. And in fact, that I think is a myth. Our immigration, if you're speaking about immigration as opposed to refugee policy, and I'll get to that in a second, is much more strict in many ways in the United States, because we tend to have a system that's based on how the potential immigrant can integrate well into Canada, which means a number of sort of tests or criteria that have to be passed. Their age, are they young enough to adapt? Do they have one of the two official languages, English or French? Do they bring a certain degree of capital so that when they establish in Canada, they can begin their lives independently? Do they have a profession or a trade or a skill which is necessary to the Canadian economy? That gives extra points. And then you have an interview with an immigration officer, which then adds a few other points in terms of character and impression and all the rest of it. So it's a very selective immigration. It's about 175,000 people a year, which is larger per capita than the United States immigration. So we are probably receiving more immigrants than the United States. The United States policy is a little different. The United States tends to work on quotas. So it tends to sort of say, well, we'll give so many visas to X number of Filipinos or X number of Bulgarians. And it's kind of based on, are you first in queue, rather than what are the skills or the way you can adapt to the country. It's a different system, not better or worse, just different. And also the United States, because they're very generous people, I guess unlike Canadians in this respect, put much more, give more credit to family reunification. They've broadened the definition of family further, whereas Canada's a bit more restrictive in what we consider as immediate family. All of which is to say that the Canadian immigration is much more selective. So people have to go through much more rigorous kind of security and examination or investigation than may be the case in the United States. So I think our filters, if you will, in terms of people coming to Canada and the controlled amount of our controls are probably higher than the United States. They say in the United States, for example, there are between 8 and 9 million people who are undocumented, that do not have documentation. In Canada, it's about 40 or 50,000, which is much smaller in terms of even proportion to our population. Why? Because in Canada, our climate is very difficult. Our social services tend to be more administered by the state. So people, when they come into Canada, do bump up against authority much more quickly. If they go to a hospital, they have to be part of the healthcare system. They go to a shelter, maybe run by a municipality. And immediately they're asked, where's your documentation? So they have to show their documentation more readily than in the United States. So I think the controls are probably a little tighter in Canada. On refugees, which is the other area of immigration that people have, Canada and the United States belong to the same sort of refugee treaties internationally, and so our criteria for determining what constitutes a refugee or not are the same. And our refusal rate's about the same as the United States. We refuse about 52% of people who are requesting refugee status in Canada. In the United States, about 56%. So we're pretty close on that. So I don't think that Canada is really that much more porous, which is the way the question is sometimes put to me, than the United States. The second part of your question, which was really, will the visa policies changing as a result of the Department of Homeland Security and new regulations mandated by Congress have an impact on Canada? I don't think so. We've been, again, working very closely with Governor Ridge, now Secretary Ridge, in terms of ensuring that our passport control facilities, the machine-readable passports, the visas, the ability not to be able to counterfeit passports, is as good as U.S. quality. So there's no concern at this point about passport fraud. And on visas, Canada has never had to have visas coming to the United States, and there's no legislation or interest at this point in time of exacting visas against Canadians. I don't think that's going to happen. So for the time being, Canadian citizens and American citizens receive equal treatment under the U.S. visits program, which means that we are interchangeable with Americans. So no, I don't see a problem.
Good afternoon. Enoch Velasquez, raised in Alberta, but also live in Ontario, so kind of mixed. Just a question about maybe employment trends. A few years back, I'm a little older than the average student here, but I'm kind of going back to school here, and there was a lot of talk about brain drain about Canadians leaving Canada to go work otherwise, whether in the United States or even internationally. Any concern of that at this time? And do you feel that opportunities are still just as good in Canada for employment as, you know, previously people left Canada because of the taxes or just maybe a wider array of opportunities in the United States, being considering that the United States economy is where it's at right now? And just any comments on that, like employment trends or opportunities?
Well, I think it's a difficult question to answer in some way. A general answer, I think, would say that though the Canadian economic situation has been quite good over the last 2 or 3 years in Canada, I think the prognosis isn't bad in terms of balanced budgets, in terms of low unemployment rates, in terms of good growth, low interest rates, and so on. So our economy actually, as far as the G7 countries are concerned, is probably performing as well, if not better than most. So I think our economic fundamentals and prospects are good. So that's an important issue. Is the economy good? That usually means then that there are jobs there. Then one has to refine the question down a little bit. What kind of job skills? Now, you mentioned brain drain. If there's no question, there are certain very narrow information technology fields where, or advanced scientific and applied sciences, where Canadians might feel, as they are leaving first or second degrees in Canada, university, that they perhaps can have more opportunity in the United States. The university is better endowed, the companies are bigger, they might get better salaries, and so on. That can happen in certain areas. On the other hand, our experience has been that many Canadians who actually come to the United States and develop these skills and get the experiences that some of these advanced companies or universities can do, often will come back to Canada because there are other things they like about Canada. It's not just a question of more salary or, there's a certain kind of feeling about being part of a country. Now, that's not everybody, but some people. So there are people who gain experience in the United States and then come back and then, of course, do quite well because they've got very, very good training from the United States. And brain drain, of course, is a relevant term, too, because as we may lose some people in the United States, we are gaining people from other countries as well, which, of course, developing countries are not happy about because they're saying we're bleeding off their brightest and best for their own economic futures and development. So it's a very difficult question that you posed me, honestly, and I think each person has to make that decision in terms of whether they want to live or work in one or the other country based on their own circumstances. As a general proposition, I think we don't feel there's a big brain drain. It's not a problem for Canada. We're not looking at it as a problem. We're certainly attempting to endow our universities and put more money into research and development to keep people in Canada. And maybe that's a reaction to a concern we had several years ago. But at this point, I think, given the strength of our economy, I think we're not too concerned about it. And I think the possibilities are probably fairly good for employment in Canada. And they say that, if you're a Canadian, sometimes you like because you get better access to hockey games. Simple as that. Thank you. Thank you.